Hi, good evening. My name's Mike. I am a project manager. I'm not a UX professional, full disclosure, but I had a fair sort of degree of kind of UX exposure within this project. So Find Me in Kakuma was what's called a P3 project at Thoughtworks, Pillar 3 projects. Pillar 3 being one of the core kind of foundational principles that Thoughtworks upholds. And many pieces of work we undertake are kind of rated on the basis of these pillars. P3 means social and economic justice, so where there's a kind of strong humanitarian or potentially environmental cause. This is where the way we would sort of term this sort of work. So I want to talk about the lessons learned from this particular project. And in the context of what we actually learnt from Kakuma itself, which is a refugee camp in Kenya, along with some of the lessons learnt as an organization and how we approach this sort of activity in future. So a little bit about Kakuma first of all. So it's northwest Kenya. It's a long-lived refugee camp. It's been there for 25 years. Established in 1991 in response to the Sudanese crisis at the time. It's now around 200,000 refugees, although the numbers fluctuate, but sort of generally over time increase. And over half are from South Sudan, and that population is certainly increasing at the moment because of the renewed conflict between the two major tribal groups, who are the Nuer and the Dinka. So it's mainly a newer population there. But the reason we were really focusing on this camp is because 12,700 South Sudanese children are registered as unaccompanied. Those have been registered by UNHCR. The number's probably a lot higher than that. In fact, the registrations only started about 3 years ago anyway, so yeah, many would have arrived before that time, although many children have actually grown up in the camp and effectively lived almost their entire lives there. So how did we come to get involved in this project? We were introduced to a Belgian filmmaker called Lieven Corthouts, who is the chap on the left, by an organization based in Soho called Good Pitch, who looked to partner filmmakers with other partners, potentially technology companies, in order to increase the social impact of their documentaries. So Lieven had been traveling around East Africa for some time, lived in Ethiopia for 10 years. He then went to Kenya and ended up spending 5 years living in the camp, during which time he actually ran a phone and cosmetics shop. So there he is there. He very much sort of became sort of part of got into the way of life there. But he was, the issue of unaccompanied children was something he was very aware of. And the documentary he made there is called The Invisible City, and that follows the lives of 3 children, one of whom, who's quite a young girl called Nyakong, the girl on that opening slide. She had arrived without her parents, or without her mother at least. So frequently what happens is children arrive in the camp with a guardian. So they'll have a guardian who's from their culture and language group, but often don't have any means of reconnecting with their parents. They may have a South Sudanese phone number, for instance, but chances are it doesn't actually work, or they can't call it from Kenya. So 9 times out of 10, they are completely unsuccessful. And although there are NGOs present in the camp, such as the Red Cross offer very limited abilities currently in order to be able to try and reconnect these children with their parents. So that's sort of the current situation. So Lieven conceptualized a Find Me app, sort of a way of being able to match children with their parents within the camp, such that they could be reconnected. And primarily, actually, what he was interested in was actually reconnecting children and parents where the parent was also in the camp. So with a population of 200,000 people, that actually happened quite frequently. Sometimes the parents would arrive, but there was no awareness, and none of the organizations within the camp actually proactively did much to help with the reconnection. So we ended up spending 3 days in Brussels doing a series of discovery workshops, and what we really tried to do here was map out the journey of a refugee leaving their home country and making the way to Kakuma. So looking into the experience of arriving, the registration in the camp. So they are processed via UNHCR officials when they arrive, and then they make their way into a reception center, and at that point they are allocated a plot within the camp. So first of all, actually initially, you know, they tend to be housed within a sort of a tent, and after a while they'll actually have a house built at that point. So we really want to get to sort of grips as to kind of why children actually arrive unaccompanied in the first place, and there's a multitude of reasons, and so frequently it can be that the parents are just unable to look after them or fear for their safety, or have other children that they wish to look after back in their home country. But it can also be due to other reasons such as marriage as well. So sometimes the mother may have remarried, and the new husband isn't actually so keen on taking another child into their care, and that then forces the child out. So we did a lot with looking at the risk factors for individuals within the camp too, looking at sort of the rate of crime, also sort of extremist activity as well. There is some Al-Shabaab presence in Kakuma, but that wasn't considered sort of material in the kind of the shaping of the app ultimately. But what we did. What we defined to really sort of help this along was a vision statement to help refugees in Kakuma find missing relatives through a web application, which refugees are both involved in designing and by its design are given choice and self-determinism. So the point around refugees are involved in designing is really a critical point actually, and this is really what this is about. We actually were very engaged directly with refugees throughout the design process. And we defined 3 core principles which we continuously referred back to through the piece of work. So child safety being paramount, really trying to minimize human interaction, so the fewer people that have access to the child's data, the better. Only storing necessary data that would actually help with the ability to match and reconnect, and secure data storage. Community-led, community-driven, really looking at, I mean, the concept itself originated in the community, so it was an idea that some of the refugees actually had spoken to Lieven about, so it kind of enabled the idea. But that they would actually be the ones that would facilitate the data entry, the data capture, and also the ones who would promote it throughout the camp too. So we'd expect them to talk about it and talk about the success of it as well. And then simplicity, limiting the validation in the fields where we capture data to make it as easy as possible to complete the process, making the user interface as engaging and simple as possible, and in line with Kakuma capabilities. So they do actually have fairly broad 3G connectivity, which we're quite pleasantly surprised about. It's not brilliant in certain parts of the camp, but other areas it is quite good, but we didn't want to make the app too heavyweight. The other thing we were very aware of as part of this process, actually we'll talk about it here, was that many of the refugees are very familiar with SMS-based services. So fewer have smartphones, but many are used to using old Nokias and use services such as M-Pesa, which is a mobile banking service in Africa. And so there was, you know, a fair degree of familiarity amongst adults arriving in the camp. But just going back to the top point there, low level of literacy and technical ability for South Sudanese refugees. So when we looked at different populations within the camp, say the Ethiopians and Ugandans and Congolese tend to be better educated when they arrived in the camp, as well as coming in with some understanding of technology and probably some smartphone exposure as well. South Sudanese generally had never seen one before in their lives. Unaccompanied children often arrive in a guardianship arrangement. With smartphones, everyone knew someone with a smartphone, so if they didn't necessarily have one, they'll be able to find someone who did. And those who did use smartphones were reasonably familiar with Facebook and WhatsApp, but actually they used both of them very differently to us. And this was there were plenty of kind of big realization moments during the project where we actually realized that we were conveying, our Western bias was kind of obfuscating what we thought the solution should be, really. I mean, Facebook, for instance, they do set up fake profiles quite a lot, or they'll update their profile frequently, and they end up with thousands of friends. They tend to just reach out all over Africa, all over the world. WhatsApp, they don't tend to use for messaging, they tend to use for voice messaging, so they'll actually record a short message for their friends. I'll meet you at the barber's in 30 minutes or something like that. So there's quite different sort of usage of these apps that we find so familiar. And in the end, given the prevalence of unaccompanied children from South Sudan, we decided to focus on the population of South Sudanese refugees, particularly the Nuer, who made up the bulk of those people. And then we used that to define personas. So we just, first of all, looked at Chol, who is an 8-year-old Nuer boy who lives in Kakuma with a guardian. His goal is to let his mother know where he is. So we were really looking at kind of what their motivations were. We were looking at their literacy, particularly English literacy and technical ability. In this case, he's recently arrived, so he's quite low on both counts there, but very playful. And there's also a risk that his guardian could decide she can no longer care for him, and that might make him vulnerable to gangs within the camp. And then we defined a role of a facilitator, so someone who could actually help, particularly those who are less technically and literate and English literate, to actually complete the process. So Bonse is actually a 20-year-old South Sudanese teacher. He's been in the camp for some time, and he's familiar with a number of languages, including English. He's gained credibility within the community there and has a goal to help others. But actually, quite often, people want to leave the camp, and many people actually talk about trying to make the people smuggling route to Europe actually through Libya. And in fact, one of the girls who's in Lieven's documentary actually did that and made it to Europe. But that was considered quite a risk to this particular piece of work. So the idea is that we'd have a kind of a 3-step process to try and keep it simple. You register as a user. At a point where the person you're looking for were to register, we would match the data sets that would happen within the system. But the critical point is verification. And actually, this goes back to the users. The users themselves had to verify that the match is valid. It's a real match. It's the person you're looking for. Or actually, even if it is the person you're looking for, I still want to reconnect with them. So the first thing we did was build an envision prototype, and here it is here. So this was something, I wouldn't say we user tested here, but we did get a little bit of feedback, and it kind of made it very clear that envision as a tool for kind of testing isn't actually particularly good, because it doesn't sort of necessarily replicate all the necessary interactions and can cause a fair amount of confusion. So we kind of quickly went on to HTML prototype, which was fairly lightweight, which I'll show you very soon. But Lieven, when he went back out to Kakuma, did some user testing. We had to really help him through this, actually. It was quite difficult for him to do it because he was so certain it was going to work that if he got any sort of inkling or positive feedback, he would come back to us and was like, yeah, it's working great. But actually, when we really dug into it, it turned out that simply wasn't the case at all. And he did some comparative testing with Somalis and Ethiopians. And I think kind of generally, they were sort of technically savvy enough to understand the app. But nearly all South Sudanese struggled with navigational patterns and the wording of questions. They would certainly need a facilitator. And what we did was very quickly, iteratively update the prototype and then quickly test the next version. And we used WhatsApp and Google Forms to collect the feedback for Lieven to feedback to us. So we were getting it back frequently and turning around changes very quickly. And then we adapted the UI to the point where smartphone-aware refugees were actually quite comfortable with it. So I'm going to give you a quick demo of it. So the first version of the prototype actually listed all the questions on one page. And one of the big things we uncovered was the fact that if the keyboard popped up and overlaid a question, people wouldn't realize, they wouldn't think to scroll, or they just had no concept of scrolling. So the South Sudanese would just tend to think the process was broken and hand it back. So one thing we did very early on was split the questions out onto individual pages. Another example here is just the language, really. So what is your full name? So initially, we just had what is your full name. We didn't have any help text like this here, just type in your first name. Father's name and grandfather's name, which is the fairly standard format for South Sudanese. But without that, just saying full name, you got all manner of responses. And actually, people actually didn't even understand what they meant. So some people wouldn't enter anything, or you would get a nickname, or you would get a partial name. So we wanted to collect as much detail as we could. So we wanted to encourage them to enter it. And actually, that just meant we had to be very specific and very direct with our questions as well. So going from a rather fuzzy question asking format, we had to be very direct in them. So we ask gender, age, and an age we were thinking, right, it may be that the verification step in the process differs depending on how old you are. So if you're a child, we may actually give you the choice of verifying the other person that you matched with ahead of the adult for child safety reasons. We ask about their village and country, and then a contact phone number, which would have to be a Kenyan number in this case. And then we ask questions of the person that they're looking for. So the name of the person, their relationship to you, also where they're from. The final step here is actually what we thought would be the verification step initially, which is actually recording a voice message so that the other person could then verify, yes, that sounds like the person we're looking for. But no one really understood this step. People didn't understand why we were doing it. People they just wouldn't know what to say. So they would hit record and then they just remain silent. So there were a number of usability challenges, but also it really became clear that as a kind of a mechanism for people to try and sort of verify another person, it just wasn't going to stand up as well as we had hoped. So we thought about going to a photo verification solution instead, which probably seems kind of the more obvious one to go to. And part of the reason why we didn't jump to it straight away was that in an earlier version of the app before we came on board, there were some issues with the time it would take to upload photos from the phone. But we wanted to actually build it right into the HTML of the app itself. And yep, that would be the flow essentially, just the ability to take a photo. But the verification step would then mean that if you were matched with multiple people, it becomes much easier to actually scan photos rather than listening to multiple messages. So we kind of had this Tinder-esque idea that people could sort of swipe left and right and things like that, but we never got as far as actually building that. So that was the prototype. Now, throughout all of this process, we were talking to various NGOs. We talked to International Committee of the Red Cross. We talked to UNICEF. We talked to Amnesty International, World Vision. And this was to talk about child protection concerns. It was also to talk about the solution itself. And it became apparent very quickly, actually, that we were operating in quite an apparently saturated ecosystem. So there are a number of other products out there that other organizations actually run. So ICRC, UNICEF, and there's also a not-for-profit company called Refunite that have a global presence. they also have reconnection tools. ICRC have Snapshot and Restoring Family Links program. UNICEF have applications called Rapid FTR and Primero, but those are run by, all of these applications and processes are run by those NGOs, so you always need NGO workers in order to run the process. And this has made us sort of question whether or not FindMe had a place in all of this. And I think in the end, because of the fact it was going to be owned and operated by refugees, we felt it was still worth pursuing. But our focus was largely on the system, and Thoughtworks is a technology organization. The operation of that system, with facilitators in the camp, and things like payments, and actually ensuring that they were properly vetted so that actually they were trustworthy individuals, they could be trusted to enter data safely and securely. Those kind of form the operation of it, and that wasn't an area that we could really get too involved in. And actually, it was also very clear that you really need a fairly robust organization around this too. And obviously, organizations like UNICEF and the Red Cross are already set up to do these things. And then we really kind of picked up 4 kind of main problem areas, really, that, or sort of areas of concern where this greatest of expertise in these areas would need to really be brought in. So child protection particularly, and that became very apparent through talking to UNICEF and World Vision who deal with these sorts of issues. Data ownership, so the big challenge we had was that Lieven, being a filmmaker, he doesn't have a business, he doesn't have an organization. And the whole issue of who would ultimately own the data and what would happen if there were to be a breach was considered quite problematic. Local capacity and motivation, so the people on the ground to actually run the application. We were talking about probably about 6 facilitators, but actually we would need more, so you need to encourage more people to join and have the time motivation to do it, because many of them are actually teachers or shopkeepers, so this is only a part of what they might be doing in the camp. And then some ongoing software development as well. Now the point is here that this is a long-term initiative and would take at least 2 years to actually pan out. So I guess sort of, with a heavy heart, it was decided ultimately that what we would actually do was wrap all this up and actually provide a set of comprehensive recommendations, and also make public a case study for what we learned along the way as well. So in the end, we provided contacts across the NGO space for Lieven to work with, along with the code for the actual prototype itself, and a clear process, so a way of kind of approaching a problem like this, learning, iterating on something, and adapting a piece of software and adapting the design of it. And I think really sort of the next steps for him are to continue those conversations. He is talking to the International Red Cross still, he's talking to UNICEF, and there are options as well about the software becoming modular. So maybe it could actually work with some of these systems that they've already built. Perhaps as a front end, perhaps the fuzzy matching logic that we've defined could actually better solutions such as RefUnite's matching platform. So in the end, lessons learned. Establishing a culture's relationship with technology is essential, and be prepared to trial a number of ideas. Don't assume that because the average person on the street in London might be able to use it, that another culture will find it as readily accessible. Stopping a project is not necessarily failure. I think in the end that we did deliver a lot of value with these recommendations, and actually, we're keen to see this work continue. And an example of a changed practice, new business model, or new technology can be disruptive in the humanitarian space, but must be facilitated in a shared write-up. So we've made our findings available to the NGOs that we've been working with, and insights into technology, UX, and typical organizational challenges allow the discovery of new partnerships opportunities. So Lieven wasn't aware of any of these partnership opportunities before we stepped in, and hopefully that's the way this can now proceed. So thank you very much. this one.
Oh, this one, sorry.
You said you need to be direct with specific questions. Did you find that as a cultural thing?
So it appeared to be certainly true for South Sudanese. Some of the other people we tested with from Uganda and Ethiopia had been in the camp for quite a lot longer and actually had been schooled in the camp too. So I think their grasp of English was sufficient that they didn't necessarily need much more direct questions than that. But it's certainly a very cultural thing. I think if there's any ambiguity, in the case of the South Sudanese, they would stop. They wouldn't even ask a question about what it meant. It's like, I don't understand this, and give the phone back.
Yes.
Yeah, you touched on the connection issues with uploading sort of photos. In terms of the sort of different platforms you're designing for, was there anything you experienced there? Because I've heard sort of in some African countries, things like Blackberries can be far more prominent than they are in Europe.
Yeah, so we were designing for Android. They use effectively sort of Samsung knockoff phones, a lot of them. So sort of they've got a phone, there's a brand called Techno, which is made in China, and it's about £40 or so for a smartphone. They're actually fairly reasonable. We tried it out. It appeared to function fairly well, but yeah, that appears to be the platform of choice. Yeah, no one has an iPhone in the camp.
Caroline?
What made you go for English as the language?
Because English is fairly well. That is a good question. It made it easy for us, I think, is probably the first answer. The facilitators that Lieven was working with all spoke fairly reasonable English, and we spoke to them as well. In fact, actually, some of them spoke very good English. Some of them are teachers as well, so they teach English in the school there. But we did consider the fact that you would probably at least need a Swahili version, because that's the other dominant language in Kenya, and also fairly common across the Horn of Africa as well. I think if you were to greater contextualize it, then you would probably be looking to adapt it for multiple languages. But actually with, say, the South Sudanese and say the newer, although they can speak it, they can't read it. So it doesn't necessarily help you. In fact, it's probably 9 times out of 10 better to have the writing, the script in English rather than in their native language.
Okay,